In today's episode of Locked On Pelicans, I have three wild things that realistically I could see happening this season. I'll tell you why CJ McCollum gets traded, Willie Green gets fired, and a surprising starter at center. It's the Thursday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans at NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, here with y'all on this Thursday, and we've got a pretty fun show. We're going to look at three wild things that I do realistically think could happen. CJ McCollum being traded, Willie Green getting fired, and Trey Jemison starting at center. And I'll explain the reasoning behind all of those things. Not saying they will happen, but I do think it is pretty realistic on all of those, to be perfectly honest with y'all. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 to get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And, of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. So let's get into this one. Three wild things that realistically could happen for the Pelicans. First one I got for you is CJ McCollum gets traded. I said this on Locked On Fantasy Basketball, where he was kind of looking for like a hot take thing. And I said, CJ getting traded, not Brandon Ingram, not anything else, is CJ getting traded. And this might hinge on whether or not CJ comes off the bench. And we don't know for sure whether that's going to be the case or not. And look, they could potentially use his shooting in the starting lineup. More on the lineup in the next segment here. But if CJ comes off the bench, that is a lot of money to be paying a six-man. He's making over $33 million this year. Now, he's coming off a very, very underrated offensive season last year. 20 points per game, 8.4 three-point attempts per, and he shot it at a 43% rate. That's actually the highest he's ever shot from three in his career. He had a very good offensive season. 4.3 boards, 4.6 assists. Not great on the defensive side of the ball, but when you're coming in off the bench, you don't necessarily need to be an elite defender, I think. But that's a lot to pay someone coming off the bench and conceivably for a slightly smaller role. And when you look at guys that are movable, tradable, CJ feels more tradable, more movable, maybe even more so than Brandon Ingram. Now, his value, you would imagine, is less than Brandon Ingram, but that also kind of adds into maybe that means you're not expecting as much in return, and that's why you can get a deal done. And one of the things to keep in mind is it's a fairly short contract. It's this year and it's next year, and that's it. This year, it's $33.333 repeating million. Next year, it's just a tad over $30 million, 30.1 if you're rounding up. On an expiring deal, some team might be interested in that. And while expiring contracts aren't the value that they used to have when free agency was really a thing, this is not like an albatross of a contract. And if you include a first-round pick to essentially dump him somewhere, you can make this work, I think, even to a team like the Detroit Pistons or another team that has some semblance of a little bit of cap space and could maybe use a veteran on their roster or just wants the first-round pick. So if you're not expecting like a ton in return, you trade him for, you kind of break that $33 million up into mid-tier salary. We've talked about this with Brandon Ingram. And that's, when we did the show on could you get Robert Williams, you can't really because of the way the contracts are. They don't really have guys that are on $15 million, $20 million, $10 million contracts. You need a couple of those so you can aggregate them or you can kind of trade for other guys since the money needs to work. There's not very many $30 million players that you could trade CJ McCollum for that you would at least want on this team. And that presents the problem. But if his value is less, could you kind of turn CJ McCollum into two rotation guys, or then use one of those guys you get along with a future first-round pick to trade for, Wendell Carter Jr. or someone like that to get the starting center that you are looking for. And we've talked about doing that with Brandon Ingram, but I think the issue with Ingram is if he signs the extension, you can't trade him. If you trade him now, his value is going to be even lower because he's on that expiring deal and no one really wants to give him that big next contract. But given that CJ has another year, that it's only $30 million, I think that becomes a pretty movable piece for New Orleans should they want to do it. So my kind of wild prediction here is it's CJ who gets traded, not Brandon Ingram, not anyone else really, when you're kind of looking at the big name players that could. I don't think you're going to get a ton in return. And I think CJ as your sixth man off the bench, and we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow if he stays and has that role, and he might be starting, we don't know. I do think that's the type of player that maybe is in the running for sixth man of the year, partially because you would imagine maybe he's going to be closing games, something along those lines. That's a useful player to have for this team too, depending on how some of the roles shake out. And look, if you have Zion Williamson, you need more shooters, and it's really as simple as that. And CJ is one of the elite ones in the league, and that doesn't even count in his veteran presence and what he adds to the team in that regard. This is the guy who got Zion Williamson back to the team that year that he was out for the entirety of the season, and got Zion to return because he kind of publicly shamed him a little bit, and it worked. And sometimes you need that guy to do that sort of thing. So CJ does play an important role in a variety of aspects with this team, but if you need to upgrade your roster, or if you just decide you need a center, and we'll talk more about the center position, kind of in the next segment and the third segment too, maybe that's how you go about getting it. It's just, look, if you're going to pay Trey, Zion's on his extension. Let's say Brandon Ingram signs an extension too that's a reasonable number for both him and the team. So it's not like a completely team-friendly deal. You have DeJounte Murray on his extension. You can't pay all of those guys and keep them. And someone is going to have to be the odd man out. Right now, given that they can't even trade Brandon Ingram, it doesn't seem like it's going to be him, right? And so if it's not going to be him, who is it going to be? And that becomes, kind of like the big question here. And then all signs start to point to CJ McCollum. So if they need to really do something to kind of shake this roster up, CJ McCollum, in my opinion, could be the biggest name that's going to go. The wild kind of idea of CJ McCollum being traded. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So coming up next, another big wild thing that could happen. Willie Green could get fired. There's a couple of reasons for this, and it goes beyond maybe what you're thinking, and I'll explain. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is my go-to ticketing app, and Gametime is a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. They're going to do a lot of that work for you. And they also have those curated deals to find the best price on great seats. They also, and I love this when you're going to a different place that you've never been before, the seat view. So you know the view that you're getting the exact tickets that you want before you buy. And if you toggle the all-in prices, you're just never going to be surprised by fees or anything like that. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime, whether that is Pelicans games, concerts, theater, whatever it is, they've got it. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDO and NBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. So subscribe everywhere. And now for your second listen of the day, Locked On NBA. There's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's keep talking about another wild thing that could happen. And that's Willie Green getting fired before January. So a pretty early firing before we're halfway through the season at that point. If this team feels like they're underperforming, and they underperformed last year. They did not reach their potential last season. They made the playoffs. That's good. But I did a show right before that this season was a disappointment that they had to go through the play-in tournament because there were some winnable games that they just kind of threw away. They did not reach their potential. It wasn't a matter of when they do, it was if, and that if didn't come to fruition. So this is a critical year, and the West is going to be tough. 1 or 2 mistakes puts you in the play-in tournament because your margin for error this year, just because of how competitive the West is going to be really, really low. So if they feel like they are underperforming, the team just might feel a need to make a change. And it's easier to do so this year with his contract. Last season, it was reported before the season started or during the season that he had signed an extension per Christian Clark of NOLA.com. Had said that. So he signs an extension. So one, that's fine. You never want to go into the final year of a coach's deal without an extension on the books. That's a dumb thing. If they make the playoffs, you're going to have to pay them even more, right? And if they're not good, you don't want to give them an extension, so you just kind of fire them. You never want to go in with a coach on the final year of his deal. If Willie Green had made the playoffs, and then some team was like, hey, we need a coach, we'll throw money at you, and he walks from New Orleans, that's a bad look. Right? That's not a good thing. Or in negotiations, now you got to pay him even more, and this team doesn't necessarily want to do that. Well, he's in the extension now. This is the first year of it, it sounds like, because it was a 2-year extension. So there's one more year after this. You can fire him this year, and then you're just basically eating one more year of the extension, and that's it. Not 2 years, not 3, not 4. It's at least a lot easier to swallow that sort of pill and eat that money when it's only a 1-year thing, even though you fire him in the middle of the season, than it would be otherwise. So you're in position to do it now, I feel like. You weren't going to fire him before the extension kicked in, but now that you're in it, you can be like, this isn't working. We're going to rip the Band-Aid off. And truthfully, the team has actually done at least a good job of that, trying to undo mistakes that they made in the first place. So his contract kind of, in my opinion, lends itself to making this move should they be underperforming. This is a critical year, and we've said we need to see Willie Green grow and change, whether that's relying on kind of the players that are like Willie Green. And maybe that's going to be Javonte Green this season. Maybe he's good, maybe he's not, right? Is there going to be the right role for someone like Trey Murphy and others here? So that is what we're kind of like looking at. If it just feels like, the rotation seem wrong. And I think the rotation is like criticism of coaches is something that we fall in on just like a little bit too easy and isn't always really the biggest thing when it comes to that. Playing a different 8th or 9th man isn't going to really change the way the team is going. But Fletcher Mackel, friend of the show here of WDSU Channel 6, said he expects Daniel Tice to be starting, per sources. Is that really the move? Does that hold the team back? And if those are the decisions that Willie Green is making and it is actively holding the team back, or he's just kind of falling into the traps that he has before, we know what a Willie Green kind of player is. Sometimes you don't always want to play those guys, right? If you're doing that, if Willie Green is doing that, you probably need to make a change because it's actively harming you. CBS Sports, and we're going to talk more about their rankings tomorrow, put out a article where they were kind of ranking the head coaches, and Willie Green's kind of in the bottom, like in that middle. So I've always said 5 guys help you win games, 5 guys actively lose you games, I think. And then 20 coaches are in the middle. They're basically putting Willie Green in the bottom of that 20 in the middle. So somewhere from like 15 to 25, they kind of put him in. So in the bottom half of the league. If that's kind of what's happening here and you need to elevate it, it just might be a move you have to make. You have James Borrego, who this team is very, very high on, who, coached 1 game last year, I don't want to read too much into that. Maybe can step in and at least help you out with it. And the team has kind of been in this position before where they had someone they should have elevated and didn't, right? With Alvin Gentry, they wanted to fire him during that final season, the bubble year, and they didn't. And, they kept him when they could have fired Alvin Gentry and auditioned Chris Finch for that job. Didn't. Chris Finch eventually went to Minnesota, and now he's one of the better head coaches, it feels like, in the league. And that's a missed opportunity by New Orleans, I think. If you think Borrego is kind of that type of brilliant mind, had a run of bad luck with the Charlotte Hornets, what have you, elevate him and give him that kind of trial run this season and do it earlier. And that's why I said Willie Green gets fired before January, if that's the case, to give James Borrego enough time to try and ramp up and get this team kind of in the vision that he has. They went away from the Borrego offense last year, and he was kind of brought in to be the offensive coordinator. Part of that was with, Brandon Ingram kind of not following orders, not being as coachable. But there also maybe was some friction, maybe, between Willie Green and Borrego too, and they kind of went away from the Borrego style of things. Well, if there's no one ahead of him, he can institute what he wants. And if that's the way the team feels they need to go, that's something that they could do here. But we've seen kind of the trappings of Willie Green, leaning too heavily on defense. 6th best defense, 7th best defense last year. That's good. The year before that, the exact same thing. Love that. But you've seen them not be able to come back from double-digit deficits. And if the defense first approach was working, they would have won those games. But it wasn't, right? They might get stops, but if you're already down 10 and you can't score yourself because of the players that you have out there on the court, you don't come back and you don't win those games. And that is a big problem too. And that's something that maybe they need to look at and consider and figure out what they want to do with that sort of thing. So you could see David Griffin, who at that point would be kind of a little bit on the hot seat himself with all of this, and you would imagine there's some sort of extensions and stuff like that for playing him here, that he's at least maybe aligned with Willie Green, if not longer than Willie Green, that, he is feeling the pressure, and maybe the move is let's fire Willie Green and let's put in James Borrego. Look, he did that in Cleveland when they fired David Blatt and elevated Ty Lue, and they won a title that year. You saw the Bucks fire Adrian Griffin after 43 games, I think it was, last season, and hire in Doc Rivers to do that. You saw Minnesota do that with Chris Finch during the season. Hire him in a way, that's one of the weirder ones, from the Toronto Raptors, I think, or whatever team he was an assistant coach on. They fired their head coach and were like, hey, here you go. You got the keys now, Finch. And it all worked out. So those type of moves can serve as a catalyst for the team and wake them up, elevate them, and make them better. And, it does seem like the players seem to like Borrego too. So given that it's such a critical year, if we're seeing kind of the same old Willie Green, and look, there's a lot that he does. I don't want to sound like I'm ragging on him here. They won 49 games. He's doing things well here, and the players have a lot of respect for him too, and he does get their buy-in. And in my opinion, that's the biggest thing that a coach can do. If he is getting all of that, then I do think that is an okay thing. But if it's just not working and you're not winning games, you got to make the playoffs this year. You got to try and avoid the play-in tournament. Make a move and see if it lends to some good things. It might just be making a move to make a move, but it still just might be needed to get fresh voices, fresh ideas, and kind of get out a little bit of the cycle that this team has been in for a period of time, particularly if the starting lineup, is minimizing shooting, right? If they are starting Daniel Tice, what is the starting lineup? Is it Murray, Ingram, Herb, Zion, Tice with CJ and Trey on the bench? Do you have a true shooter in that lineup? Is it Murray, Ingram, CJ, Zion, Tice? You see the concerns here when it comes to that sort of thing, and that just feels like you're minimizing your roster. If you're doing that and it's not leading to good things, or the starting lineup isn't giving them what you need, that's a problem. Maybe you got to make a change to someone who can get the most out of that starting unit, or figure out a starting unit that's going to do it and doesn't want to kind of play by, kind of just the traditional sized center, something like that. But let's say Willie Green stays, and it is Daniel Tice starting on opening night. I don't think he's going to stay as the starter that long. I think it could be Trey Jemison, a guy on a two-way deal that's going to be in that role sooner rather than later. I'll explain why I think I could see Trey Jemison starting, maybe even on opening night. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We got something a little bit different for you. You've heard us talk about FanDuel a lot here on the show. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game, and all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. If you're looking to get in on some action, the Saints are a 2.5-point favorite over the Eagles. They're rising up in the power rankings, feeling good at home. I think Derek Carr was talking about how he feels there's going to be excitement. He knows they've got to prove it to the fans. There's some extra motivation there. Feeling good about the Saints' chances this weekend. You also have the Pelicans, who are kind of growing as a favorite. Now it's -6.5 per FanDuel on opening night over the Chicago Bulls. Started at 5. People are kind of getting behind the Pels here. Get in on that action over at FanDuel and get the free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. We are everywhere. Just search Locked On Pelicans. Become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans too. If you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And now for your second listen, Ross Jackson, Locked On Saints, making sense of that offense, looking at Derek Carr, who's in MVP conversations right now. Everything you need for the black and gold over the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, I got one more wild thing that could happen this season, and it's a surprising starter. We'll say on opening night. Trey Jemison signed this offseason on a 2-way contract. The presumed starting center, if they go with a traditional center, is Daniel Theis. Fletcher Mackel tweeted that out. I think it could end up being Trey Jemison. You look at Daniel Theis, who, for his career is fine, but he's 6'8". He plays bigger than that. He's a decent rebounder. He's tough too. Tough dude. But if you just need more size on opening night, or just size in general, 6'8" and playing bigger than you are isn't the same as having size. Carlo Makovic is just unproven. Feels like he could be the type of starting center big man that fits this team, but I think you've just got to see him prove it in the NBA first, even though the returns in Summer League looked really good and he looked like an NBA player. Someone who kind of has that mix of slight upside and NBA experience is Trey Jemison. 6'11", was with the Pelicans in training camp in preseason a year ago. Played for both the Wizards and Memphis last year, finishing the season out as a starter in Memphis with all of their injuries. And in Memphis, in 23 games, 14 as a starter, playing almost 25 minutes per, 7.4 points, 5.8 rebounds per game. Shot the ball pretty well because just did all of his damage close to the basket. Decent free throw shooter on all of that. And his size allowed him to give that team a little bit of rim protection, even if it's not elite. That's kind of melding everything you need into one player, I think. And that's rather important, I think. Look, Daniel Theis, who I like, is going to be 33 this season and was on his way out of the NBA. He was going to Europe. No NBA team was calling till the Pelicans came and signed him because they just straight up needed somebody. He was not going to be an NBA player next season. That says something. Serviceable for a couple minutes per night, probably. Can you rely on him to play 25 per? I really don't know. Trey Jemison at least has the size. Right? If you throw Daniel Theis on Zach Edey, who's in the Pelicans, division here, I don't know how well that's going to go. Trey Jemison at least is a bigger dude, just physically bigger, and can maybe handle that sort of job a little bit more. And given that he's got some NBA experience under his belt, you might see Willie Green, who relies on that, right? Loves those veteran kind of players, as the guy over someone like Carlo. And so that makes a lot of sense to me that you could see Trey Jemison in that role, I think. They've done this before. They've done this before with two-way players. Guys that they sign that they think are value kind of adds to this roster. You don't have a roster spot or you want to make them kind of prove it a little bit. Put them on a two-way deal. You saw Jeremiah Robinson-Earl do that with the team and immediately get minutes, almost start. You could do that with Trey Jemison. So while it sounds kind of wild at first that a guy on a two-way deal is going to be the starting center on opening night, this team has kind of done things like that before. And maybe it's the route that they want to go if that's truly what they feel. And if they're really not committed to playing kind of a more small ball lineup, that death lineup that we talked about earlier this week. And if you haven't listened to that show, go give it a listen, because it truly probably is the best lineup for this roster. But if Willie Green maybe wants to close games with that, and the Warriors didn't start their death lineup, they closed games with it, then you're going to need some size, and just Daniel Theis, who's on his way out of the NBA, that concerns me. He played well enough in the Olympics, not kind of a key starring player for that Germany team, but is important to them. I think there's a role for him on this roster, but if you need someone who can kind of take that beating, save Zion, all of those sorts of things, Trey Jemison feels like the guy who it was, and he has starting experience as recently as the end of last year. I'm not saying this is the right move. I'm not saying you're going to get great production out of him. Daniel Theis, for his career at 6'8", is a better rebounder than Trey Jemison. Again, small sample size for Trey. Last year, though, when you look at rebounding rates, Trey Jemison didn't do a very good job of that with the Memphis Grizzlies. CJ was arguably like a better rebounder than him last season, kind of when you look at their positions and all of that. That's mildly concerning, because rebounding is going to be important on the defensive side of the ball for this team. So if he can't do that, no, he's probably kind of unplayable. But if you believe in that size and the strength, 6'11", 260, with some NBA experience, that's maybe a guy that they're going to end up going with if he impresses in training camp, if he impresses in preseason. And I think he's going to get the opportunity to do so. So, I don't know if it's a wild prediction. I think it's kind of wild to say a guy on a two-way deal would be starting at center for this team, but I could definitely see it happening, kind of given the state of the centers on the Pelicans roster. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. We're going to look at some rankings in tomorrow's episode. And could Herb Jones win Defensive Player of the Year? How does Zion get MVP voting, or will he? I got a hot take on both those things. That's coming up here in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans. I'll see y'all then.